All right, hi everybody. We're going to talk today about Chapter 5, and in Chapter 5, it's mostly about empiricism, but they also stuck a little bit of other stuff in there, including sensationalism, which is essentially the French version of British empiricism, and then positivism, which is a little bit different, but not terribly. It's just sort of stuck at the end as a filler, right? So in this chapter, I mean, granted, John Locke is the major player in the role of British empiricism. There are others, don't get me wrong. We'll discuss them very briefly, but we're going to focus on that John Locke and his principles because the other British empiricists basically say the same kinds of things. Okay. So as British empiricists were coming up and rising, what was the zeitgeist of the time? I mean, clearly astronomy and physics were now accepted. Galileo's contention that there were more than 7 heavenly bodies. In other words, knowledge was gained through observation. The Renaissance allowed for more freedom of expression, more creativity. Education was starting to spread, spreading ideas. Remember going back to, in particular, Mr. Printing Press, Johannes Gutenberg. Religion was based on, because of the Protestantism, religion was starting to become more personalized. I mean, the zeitgeist at this time was just, they were ready to learn. And so we can see ourselves a map of Europe, and it's really pretty cool. I like this. In the middle, it just says, the Empire. You know what the Empire is, right? That's the Habsburgs, the Habsburgian Empire. It's quite an impressive thing. The Empire, okay? And we see that little old England is stuck off to the side a little bit. At that point in 1740, England was not a tremendously powerful world player, but they definitely had influence, especially in the world of philosophy. And so here's your belief or definition of empiricism: the belief that all knowledge is derived from experience, especially sensory experience. That's right, as opposed to nativism, which is to say, you're born blank, as John Locke is going to be saying, the tabula rasa, blank slate. You're born with nothing. Okay? So now, according to this basic concept, I mean, what is its implication? Knowledge cannot exist until a sensory experience has first been experienced. All right? When you're born, you got nothing. Okay? The word empirical, however, is used in a scientific sense to refer to the fact that knowledge, it's sort of like knowledge should be based on observation. Something like that. So it's a slightly different use of the word, but the same basic idea. That is to say, see it. And so I got Thomas Hobbes up here very briefly. Thomas Hobbes, he felt that humans could be understood using the same techniques as geometry, deductive. That is to say, if you came up with a few undeniable premises, like reflexes and laws of association, hint, hint, we're going to get to, many undeniable conclusions could be reached, right? He said the universe is just matter and matter in motion, and it's all mechanical, and human beings are just mechanical, okay? So he was very inspired by Euclidean geometry here. Well, John Locke, he wrote in his major book, the essay concerning human understanding, whatever. In his major book, he criticized Descartes' notion of an innate idea, and this was very troublesome because people felt that an innate idea had been placed there by God, and so to attack this concept of an innate idea was to attack God. Okay? Well, here was his essential argument. I'm sure he was much more elegant than I'm going to put it, but he basically said, look, if innate ideas exist, then every single human being should have them. But there's not a single idea that every single human being has. There's none. Okay? And because of that, there's no such thing as an innate idea. There's a different image of John Locke. Okay? Here's what he said. You're born blank. He describes the tabula rasa, or blank slate. You are born with nothing. All thoughts come from sensations. Okay? The sensations through your eyes and your ears, your 5 senses, or more if it... Different class, I'll talk about your senses, but for most of us, the 5 senses, okay? But these senses stay, the senses, let's say for an example, an idea An idea is a mental event that lingers after the sensation has ceased. So an idea is nothing more than a sensation that existed in the past that is still lingering. Okay? Reflection is the ability to use the powers of the mind to creatively rearrange ideas. Okay? In other words, to make something larger. Okay? Now, this reflection John Locke wrote multiple versions of this of his book, and editions, I guess we would call them. And this thing called reflection became a real sticking point because he realized that this word that he's using, powers of the mind, as you see in here, is the absolute ultimate form of not empirical. You can't have powers. I mean, where are powers of the mind coming from? Well, you're born with them? Wait a minute, then you're a nativist, dude. What's wrong with you? And so he didn't know how to, he tried to write his whole thing being completely empirical, yet this word powers of the mind, which was the basis of reflection, became a sticking point for him, both professionally and personally. According to John Locke, a simple idea is the mental remnant of a sensation, right? We already said an idea is like a sensation that's still lingering, okay? And according to John Locke, these are sort of like the atoms of your experience, because these simple ideas cannot be decomposed into smaller ideas. And so, let's say, for example, you might have simple ideas. You might, some sensations. You see a door. You see a window. You see a gutter. Okay, these are all simple ideas. You cannot break them down into smaller elements. However, you will then use the powers of the mind to take these simple ideas, door, window, gutters, and put them into a complex idea called house. Now, house can be broken down into the simple ideas of door, window, and gutter, but you can't take the simple ideas and break them further. Okay? And so he felt that the powers of the mind put them together. Okay? And he also had things to say about the primary and the secondary qualities, similar to what Galileo. Remember, if a tree falls in the wood and nobody was there to hear it, doesn't make a sound. And Galileo had said, look, the tree does physically fall because that is a primary quality. Mass is a primary quality. However, sound requires a perceiver, and so if there's nobody there to hear it, then the sound didn't exist. That's a secondary quality. Well, John Locke had his own little things to say. It's a similar notion, but a quality is an aspect of the physical world that has the power to produce an idea. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Primary qualities are those attributes. Those attributes of the physical objects and produce in us ideas that correspond. Doesn't make much sense. Secondary qualities are, okay, you read it. Okay, how about this? I'm gonna give you this little example to help us to understand this, or to perhaps confuse the matter worse. Okay, so the question is temperature a primary quality or a secondary quality? Okay, get yourself a bucket of hot water and put your hand in it, and you're like, damn, that's hot. Okay, does the water contain the temperature? Sounds like a primary quality of the water. Okay, well, let's take a second experiment, if we shall. Let's take 3 buckets of water. One hot, one cold, one warm. Put one hand in the hot water. Oh, shit, that's hot. Put one hand in the cold water. Ooh, cold. Hold them there for a minute. And then take both hands out and put them in the warm water. And guess what's going to happen? The one that was in the cold water now feels hot, and the one that was in the hot water now feels like it's cold. You're like, damn. I guess temperature can't be a property of the water, huh? Maybe temperature is a secondary quality because I'm perceiving it. So the idea of distinguishing between primary and secondary qualities is not quite as simple as it might seem at first. John Locke also latched on to Aristotle's old laws of association, and he really formalized these laws of association. And you're going to find that these powers of the mind that he makes reference to, he uses the laws of association to describe how the powers of the mind operate. Now, many of these other empiricists after John Locke that we're going to talk about here are going to also use this laws of association. They were very, very inspired by chemistry at this point, and how if you take this chemical and put it together, something happens. Okay, and so the laws of association are in many ways modeled under, well, not modeled under, but remember Zeitgeist, okay? And chemistry was coming to its own at this point as an experimental discipline, okay? And so associationism is a belief that the laws of association provide the fundamental principles by which all mental phenomena can be explained. Yeah, that's an old idea of going back. That's a new idea. It's a recent idea. We're talking even as recent as Skinner. So this is a consistent theme in psychology. Reflection is how simple ideas combine to form complex ideas. Reflection, looking back, combining them. The laws of association can also explain faulty beliefs, like superstitions. Okay. Hey, you buddy. We said that. I don't know wonder I got mixed up on my pictures. There it is. So, George Berkeley was and yes, this is the same guy that they named UC Berkeley for. He was Bishop George Berkeley. I believe he went to Bermuda or something. I can't remember. But anyway, according to him, knowledge is based only on ideas. Okay. He says, look, things come into an existence once they're perceived. Our perceptions are it. He, in fact, argued that only secondary qualities exist, that there is no physical world. Okay, dude, you're a little wacky, all right? The world exists. How do I keep getting there? Yeah, here I am. Ha, I'm back. All right, so he said, look, each sense modality furnishes a different type of information about an object. Your nose tells you what it smells like. Your ears tell you what it sounds like. We learn that a particular object has a particular set of sensations associated with it, okay? And so what happens is the objects we name are nothing more than an aggregate of sensations that tend to accompany each other. So, an apple, round, shiny, smooth, put together equals apple. Now, this is going to be an interesting conception for when we get to Titchener in a little while, up in structuralism. When we get to Titchener, we're going to talk about this same kind of a thing about how we could break down your mental world into these different elements. All right, wrong one. John Stuart Mill. Wait a minute, am I jumping here? Yeah, here, I said that. All right, I see. John Stuart Mill. James Mill was his father, and James Mill is an interesting character all on his own. And he had some very interesting work with moral philosophy, which is by itself an interesting. It's kind of like off to the side from this empiricism discussion, but man, it's worth looking into as part of your other studying. But we're going to talk about John Stuart Mill, and he says, this is James Mill's son, he says, every sensation leaves in the mind an idea that resembles a sensation, but it's weaker. Makes sense, okay? Things go away. Similar ideas tend to excite one another. Similar ideas, salt, pepper, because they're both on the table, and they're both in the shaker. Gotcha. When sensations or ideas are frequently experienced together, either simultaneously or successively, they become associated. Okay? And so he's essentially laying out the different laws of association. In this case, it's the law of contiguity. The law of more vivid sensations or ideas form stronger association than less vivid ones. Okay? The law of strength? I don't know. The strength of association varies with frequency of occurrence. The law of frequency. I mean, these are really he's just basically formalizing the laws that Aristotle, in fact, laid out way before him. But this is the reason I cared about John Stuart Mill, because that last slide wasn't particularly different from a lot of other stuff. But this is cool. Mental chemistry. I love this, okay? The process by which individual sensations can combine to form a new idea or sensation that is different from what created it. So, again, I told you that this chemistry was sort of like the zeitgeist going on here. So, hydrogen and oxygen at room temperature are both gas. Guess what happens? You put them together, you get water, a liquid at room temperature. So they don't even resemble each other. Okay? Here's the drill. When a new idea does emerge, it does it automatically. If you take hydrogen and oxygen and put them next to each other, can they say, oh, I choose not to come together? No, they do. It's an automatic thing. So two gases put next to each other automatically combine, and the result is something that looks completely different, a liquid. Okay, and he said this is the same kind of way that your mental life works. You have sensations. They combine together, and the combination is automatic. You do not need any powers of the mind to describe how these two ideas come together. They just do, and the result of it may be so unrecognizable and different from everything that came before it as to look like water. Okay, very cool thought. Ow, that's really, I got them out of order there. All right. No, where am I? God, this is really difficult to work with here. You know that, guys, right? All right. And so now, John Stuart Mill also described, and it was really quite cool, primary laws and secondary laws. And we, again, have had this conversation, but the primary laws are the general laws that determine overall behavior of events within a system. The secondary laws are the laws that interact with the primary laws to describe. See now, say for example, gravity is a primary law. Lovely, okay. And so you can do a pretty good job of predicting, if I drop this, how fast will it fall? But there are secondary laws like air temperature. Oh, it turns out that the temperature of the air does very slightly modify that primary law. So the primary law of gravity is modified by secondary laws. We may well have a good grasp of the primary law, not always, but in some cases, we may well have a good grasp of the primary laws and still be imperfect in our predicting of the world because the secondary laws are going to modify them. Now, in psychology, now we have these laws of gravity, okay? They're harder to find, trust me, but my entire doctoral dissertation was all about finding the mathematical laws of human decision making. I was attempting to find the primary laws. They're so general. In fact, like I said, some of my work in my dissertation involved pigeons and some involved humans, and I was looking for similarities between human decision making and pigeon decision making. And yes, it's out there. And the point at which it overlaps each other is a primary law. But now when it comes to human beings, secondary laws are really important. Now with gravity, it was like, oh, air temperature modifies gravity just a smidgen. Now let's take secondary laws. Hunger modifies decision-making radically, or fill in the blank with whatever human characteristic you can imagine. The secondary laws in psychology make it so that the primary laws are very difficult to discover, but I argue, and many others argue, that the primary laws do in fact exist, that you are a mathematically predictable creature, just like dropping an object is a mathematically predictable event, your behaviors are mathematically predictable events. But because of the presence of so many secondary laws in human beings, it becomes much more difficult to discover them with us. The French sensationalists, I've never been particularly impressed. I mean, they're lovely. I'm sure they're lovely. But here's the deal. Our Western psychology did not follow the French. It followed the British. The French were working in France. French in France. The French were working in France, doing much the same work that the British empiricists were doing. They call them the French sensationalists, and it makes sense because remember, even going way back now in this slideshow up to John Locke, all ideas were based on sensation, so the French sensationalists, same idea. And so they are often referred to as the French Newtonians of the mind, okay? All mental activity is reduced to its basic elements, the basic ideas, the same basic ideas, but we don't find, except for this course, I've never in all my years in psychology come across the French sensationalists, so I just don't see myself spending a lot of time on them. Here's another a little stick it on the end kind of a thing. It's an interesting concept, and we're going to come up with this later, especially when we talk about the behaviorists. This is going to be a big deal for the behaviorists. Scientism is an almost religious belief that science can answer all questions and solve all problems. Okay. Positivism is a contention that science should study only what you can directly experience. And it was Auguste Comte. I mean, he's an interesting character to read about. Comte, C-O-M-T-E. Check him out in your book. He's fun. He created some kind of a freaky religion, and he was like the pope of his religion, and the religion was basically science. So they say you trust only what is experienced and consistently experienced, okay? But along comes a last little... Oh, here's Comte. I got to pick a picture of Comte right here. There's Comte. Okay. Science must rely on publicly observed events or overt behaviors, things that other people can see. Okay. He also says science needs to be publicly observable. Boy, that's a big one that the behaviorists are going to latch on to, okay? And science should improve society, period. I mean, he grabbed on this Francis Bacon's contention, and he writes, I have a supreme aversion to scientific labors whose utility, direct or remote, I do not see, okay? He was very, very practical about it, okay? But finally, we're sticking in the last little one, Ernst Mach, who was actually a physicist, believe it or not. And he says that scientists should study things that are not just observable by other scientists, but guess what? For a observation to be a scientific observation, it can be an internal observation. It does not necessarily have to be publicly observable. It has to be observable, don't get me wrong. But observation is not limited to eyes, ears, nose, no. Observation can also be internal observation. And Ernst Mach's contention of Ernst Mach's takedown on positivism is going to form the basis for what Wilhelm Wundt is going to use when he establishes his first school of psychology, and that's about 3 slideshows up. So looking forward to finding out on Wilhelm Wundt, and we will see you the next time on that one.